Owen, it's Navadia from Australia. I was just wondering if Donald Trump ends up going to jail, how will that influence his cult and all of his followers? Because he won't be able to do his propaganda, he won't be able to tweet. A lot of his supporters will either denounce him or end up in jail or just won't talk about him. So a lot of that oxygen will be removed from him. So would that be able to do anything? Will that do anything in regards to his cult following? I thank you for taking my question, and I hope you have a lovely day, evening, night, whatever, especially on this wonderful Monday.
I appreciate that. I'm going to let that last one slide. As far as Trump goes, there are a number of examples of cult leaders who are currently in jail and leading the cult from jail. Probably the prime example would be Warren Jeffs of the FLDS Church. I believe it's Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints Church. It's like a Mormon offshoot. More than likely, what would happen is Trump would go to a rich person jail, more like a dormitory than a jail. Sadly, we have a two-tier justice system in this country, and basically everybody knows that. So he wouldn't be cut off from his followers completely, first of all. The second point that I would want to make is the Republican Party in the U.S., largely made up of the evangelical voting bloc, has been being primed to be a cult for a long time now. It has been forming into a cult for a long, long time. And all it needed was this figurehead to come along and seize the reins of control. So there is an underlying ideology. Trump didn't make that ideology up. Fox News did. But it exists in a lot of these people's heads. And in some cases, Trump's generals made the ideology up, like in the case of QAnon. The poster, Q, doesn't know Trump, supposedly. I mean, nobody has claimed that he does or anything. They don't know each other. They haven't coordinated efforts or any of that stuff. But he's still a Trump general because he is one of his largest supporters. He's one of his most ardent followers, and he gathers the most support for him, right? He has formed an ideology under Trump. Trump is the head of that ideology. So it's a really interesting case study in how cults operate. Trump, as a leader, would be the leader of a level 2 cult, or decentralized but focused. It's focused on a single leader, but there isn't a strict structural hierarchy like you would find with Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or anybody else, any standard traditional cult. QAnon would also be a level 2 cult, with Q, the poster, Q, at the top, but Donald Trump even above that. And then there's the decentralized, non-focused cult of republicanism. Not conservatism, but republicanism very specifically. And these three groups have kind of melded together in some kind of a weird mishmash. So if Trump did end up going to jail, which, we're waiting to see what happens, I'm not convinced that he will. But even if he did, the cult that formed under him would continue to exist and grow and flourish. The reason is because, partially, there's money in it. There are views. There are people listening. There's a massive machine behind republicanism, behind Donald Trump's cult. People want to be a part of it, and as long as that's the case, they can monetize that. They can talk about it. They can merge Donald Trump's ideology into whatever they're talking about and bring in views and clicks and things like that. The challenge is, how do we get rid of this? How do we stop this? How do we root this out of society? This disgusting, fucked up situation we find ourselves in. How do we deal with it? I know how to work with individual cult members to try to deprogram them. Deprogramming is pretty straightforward and easy. If you don't care about human rights. Back in the 80s and the 90s, deprogrammers used to come along and kidnap somebody and take them to a cabin in the woods and tie them to a chair and force the belief out of them by forcing them to face the harsh facts and reality, the end result of what their cult is doing or has done to people, forcefully talking them through this stuff against their will. And by doing that for a period of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month sometimes, working through this information with them, they would work the belief, the cult mentality out of their minds. And it worked. But you can't do that. You have to respect human rights. So we've come up with, we as in, people involved in any capacity in the psychology community, anybody interested in psychology has come up with methods of deprogramming people while also respecting their human rights. That works on an individual level. But how do you do it on a mass scale? 70 million or 71 million people voted for Donald Trump in the US election in 2020. How do we deprogram those people? When asking that question of myself, I looked to past examples of mass deprogramming. The best one that I could come up with, and the most recent, would be Nazi Germany. They did it in Germany after Hitler died. In 1945 to 1950, they spent a long time working on this problem. How do you do this? So I decided to look into it and figure out exactly what they did, how they deprogrammed these people in 1945 to 1950. This is on bbc.co.uk. It's basically a history lesson on how they deprogrammed people from Nazism after 1945. It says, Germany was now occupied and divided into 4 military zones, each controlled by one of the 4 Allied powers, USSR, USA, Britain, and France. Its capital, Berlin, was similarly divided amongst the occupiers. So this subheading is Allied Policy of Denazification. Denazification was the process of removing Nazi ideology and influence from all forms of public life in defeated Germany. The occupying allies carried this process out in a number of ways. The Nazi Party was banned, and advocating National Socialist ideas was made punishable by death. The swastika symbol and other Nazi emblems were banned in public. Germans were made to complete questionnaires about the extent of their involvement in Nazism. Ex-Nazis were taken on tours of concentration camps or made to watch video clips of Jewish prisoners. The policy aimed to force Germans to confront the crimes of the Nazi regime, but also to re-educate them in order to leave Nazism behind. In 1946, 5 categories of involvement were established: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. So, what happened in the 30s and 40s in Germany was an absolutely grotesque, horrific disregard for humanity and human life. That's what happened. The only way to root that out of the society at the time was to toss aside human rights, to capture these people and forcefully sit them in a chair and make them watch video clips of what their colleagues had done to humanize the people that they hated, to force them to realize and recognize what was really happening and what they were doing to force this extremism gradient to come to the forefront of their mind. They spent the past 10 years maybe moving from a perfectly normal and neutral position in life, not having any opinions about Jews or anybody. They're just living life, going to work every day, having a family, whatever. And gradually, over the course of 10 years, slowly more and more getting more radicalized by the speeches of populist extremists who had agendas to hurt people. They didn't realize what was happening. That's how the extremism gradient works. You don't know what's happening until you're there. You don't know you're an extremist until you're an extremist. And by that point, you feel like your extremism is justified. So after everything was all said and done, and they held the Nuremberg trials and got rid of all the leadership and everything, they had to sit these people down who were followers or lesser offenders, for example, or even offenders, and force them to break out of that gradient and see what was going on. Let's keep reading. Those who'd been involved in suspected war crimes were tried in the Nuremberg trials starting in November 1945. The first hearings concerned the 23 most important political, military, and economic leaders of Nazi Germany. Only 3 were acquitted, found not guilty, while 12 were sentenced to death. As the Cold War began and Britain and the U.S. came to see the newly created West Germany as a key ally, denazification was scaled back so as not to offend the population. This allowed a number of ex-Nazis to regain prominence, though Nazi ideology remained firmly crushed as democracy developed. So ultimately the question is, how do we deal with the de-Trumpification of the United States? This is a cult that exists in the U.S. that 71 million people are either complicit or a member, a full-blown member of. How do we do this? I don't know if there's another way to do it other than the way Germany did it in 1945. I don't know.